Betrayed by her billionaire ex-husband, she married a low-key man, only to discover he owns half of Texas. "Charlotte, you need to see this," Jake said quietly, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he spread the legal documents across their kitchen table. "I know I should have told you sooner, but I was terrified of losing you." Charlotte Wellington Thompson looked up from her morning coffee, her heart already racing at the serious tone in her husband's voice. After everything she'd been through with her first marriage, any hint of hidden secrets made her stomach clench with familiar fear. "What is it?" she asked, setting down her mug with careful precision. "Jake, you're scaring me." "These are property deeds," he said simply, his blue eyes meeting hers with invulnerability she'd never seen before. "I don't just own this ranch, Charlotte. I own most of Montana, and about half of Texas." Charlotte stared at the papers scattered before her, document after document bearing the Thompson Holdings logo, listing properties that stretched across multiple states like a real estate empire she couldn't have imagined in her wildest dreams. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I'm saying that the simple rancher you married isn't exactly who you think he is," Jake replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'm terrified that now that you know the truth, everything between us is going to change." Before we dive deeper into this incredible story of hidden wealth and authentic love, tell us where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you questioning everything you think you know about the people closest to you? Wondering what secrets might be hiding behind simple appearances? Drop it in the comments. We love connecting with our Lux Love Chronicles family, who understand that sometimes the biggest surprises come from the people we think we know best. Now, let me take you back to where this extraordinary journey began, because to understand the magnitude of Charlotte's discovery, you need to know how desperately she'd been running from exactly this kind of revelation. 2 years earlier, Charlotte Wellington had been living what everyone assumed was a fairy tale life. At 32, she was married to Richard Wellington, the tech billionaire whose software empire had made him one of the youngest people ever to grace the Forbes list. Their Manhattan penthouse overlooked Central Park. Their Hampton estate hosted charity galas that raised millions for various causes, and their lifestyle was the kind that graced magazine covers and inspired envy from people who measured success in dollar signs and social media followers. Charlotte had met Richard at her art gallery opening in Soho 7 years earlier. She'd been 25, passionate about contemporary artists, and proud of the small but respected gallery she'd built from the ground up using a modest inheritance from her grandmother. Richard had appeared at her opening wearing a custom Tom Ford suit and an air of confidence that commanded attention from everyone in the room. "This piece," he'd said, stopping in front of an abstract painting by an unknown artist Charlotte had discovered in Brooklyn. "It's either brilliant or completely pretentious. I can't decide which." "Maybe it's both," Charlotte had replied, intrigued by someone who would voice such a blunt opinion at an art opening. "Sometimes the most honest art makes us uncomfortable." "And sometimes," Richard had said with a smile that would later charm investors out of billions of dollars, "the most uncomfortable truths are the ones worth paying attention to." That conversation had led to dinner, which had led to a whirlwind courtship filled with private jets to Paris, surprise weekend trips to wine country, and the kind of romantic gestures that felt like scenes from movies. When Richard proposed 18 months later, with a ring that cost more than most people's houses and a proposal orchestrated on the observation deck of the Empire State Building at sunset, Charlotte had felt like the luckiest woman alive. The wedding had been featured in Vogue. Their honeymoon had taken them to private islands and luxury resorts across 3 continents. Their first year of marriage had been a blur of charity galas, business dinners, and the kind of social obligations that came with being married to someone whose net worth fluctuated by millions depending on daily stock market movements. But somewhere in the second year, Charlotte had begun to notice cracks in their perfect facade. Richard worked 18-hour days, even on weekends. He took phone calls during their anniversary dinner and cut their vacation short for emergency board meetings. When Charlotte suggested they start trying for children, he told her the timing wasn't right. His company was expanding into Asian markets, and he needed to focus completely on maintaining their competitive edge. After the IPO, he'd said, the same thing he'd been saying for 2 years about everything from family planning to buying a weekend house, where they could escape the city's constant demands. Charlotte had begun to feel like a beautiful accessory in Richard's life rather than a partner. She attended events where business wives were expected to look stunning and stay quiet while their husbands networked. She managed their social calendar and supervised staff at their various properties, but she'd gradually stopped working at her gallery because Richard felt it was unnecessary for his wife to have a job. "You don't need to work, darling," he'd said when she'd expressed frustration about giving up her passion. "Isn't it enough to support my career and enjoy the lifestyle we've built together?" But Charlotte had missed the creative fulfillment of discovering new artists and the independence of running her own business. She'd missed feeling like her opinions mattered and her contributions were valued for more than their aesthetic appeal. The beginning of the end had come on a Tuesday morning in October. Charlotte had returned early from a spa weekend with the other tech wives, a monthly ritual that had begun to feel more like an obligation than a pleasure, and had walked into their penthouse to find Richard's assistant, a 23-year-old named Madison with perfect blonde hair and ambitious eyes, emerging from their master bedroom wearing nothing but Richard's dress shirt. "Oh," Madison had said, her cheeks flushing with surprise but not shame. "You're back early." Charlotte had stood frozen in her own foyer, her weekend bag still in her hand, trying to process what she was seeing. Behind Madison, Richard appeared in the doorway wearing a bathrobe, his expression cycling rapidly through surprise, guilt, and something that looked almost like relief. "Charlotte," he'd said, his voice carrying the tone he usually reserved for explaining disappointing quarterly reports to investors. "We need to talk." The conversation that followed had shattered every assumption Charlotte had made about her marriage. Richard had been having an affair with Madison for 8 months. More than that, he'd been having affairs with various assistants, interns, and business associates throughout their marriage. Madison was just the most recent, and apparently the one he decided was worth the disruption of divorce proceedings. "You're a wonderful woman, Charlotte," he'd said as if he were delivering a performance review rather than ending a marriage. "But you don't understand the pressures of building an empire." Madison gets it. She supports my ambitions without questioning the sacrifices required for this level of success. "Sacrifices?" Charlotte had repeated, her voice hollow with disbelief. "Is that what our marriage was to you? A sacrifice?" "Not our marriage," Richard had replied with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never learned to consider other people's feelings. "Your expectations. Your need for emotional availability and domestic stability. Madison doesn't expect me to be home for dinner or to remember anniversaries. She understands that business comes first." The divorce proceedings had been brutal and public. Richard's team of attorneys had painted Charlotte as a gold digger who'd married for money and was now trying to claim half of an empire she'd had no hand in building. They'd ignored the fact that she'd given up her own successful career to support his ambitions, had managed their social obligations and household staff, had been the face of his charitable endeavors when positive publicity was needed. The settlement had been substantial enough to ensure she'd never worry about money, but it had come with non-disclosure agreements and social exile from the circle of people she'd considered friends. The other wives had chosen sides, and Richard's wealth and influence had made the choice easy for most of them. Charlotte had found herself alone in a city that no longer felt like home, surrounded by luxury that now felt tainted with humiliation and betrayal. Every restaurant held memories of business dinners where she'd been decorative rather than valued. Every charity gala invitation was a reminder of the social status she'd lost along with her marriage. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Charlotte had made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She'd packed her car with the few possessions that felt truly hers and had driven west until she'd found a place that felt like healing was possible. Willow Creek, Montana, population 2,847, was everything New York City wasn't. Nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains that touched the sky, it was the kind of place where people still waved to strangers and where the local diner served coffee strong enough to fuel ranch work and conversation warm enough to melt the loneliness Charlotte had been carrying like a stone in her chest. She'd rented a small apartment above the hardware store and had spent her first month doing nothing but walking the mountain trails, reading books that had nothing to do with business or society, and slowly remembering who she'd been before she'd become Richard Wellington's wife. "You look like someone who's running from something," the hardware store owner, Mrs. Patterson, had observed one morning when Charlotte had come downstairs for coffee before another day of hiking. "Or towards something," Charlotte had replied, surprised by her own honesty with this woman she barely knew. "Well, whatever it is, you're welcome here as long as you need to be." That simple acceptance, offered without curiosity about her background or judgment about her circumstances, had been the first step in Charlotte's journey back to herself. 3 months into her residence in Willow Creek, Charlotte had made another surprising decision. She decided to stay permanently. The settlement from her divorce was more than enough to buy a charming Victorian house on Main Street, and with some renovation, the ground floor would make a perfect space for a small art gallery. "You sure about this?" Mrs. Patterson had asked when Charlotte had announced her plans. City folks sometimes get restless when the novelty of small-town life wears off. "I'm not city folks anymore," Charlotte had replied, and she meant it. "I'm just folks now." If you've ever misjudged someone based on their appearance or lifestyle, you need to hear this incredible story. Hit that like button because what Charlotte discovers will change how you think about wealth, power, and what really matters in love. The Willow Creek Art Gallery had opened 6 months later with a reception that drew nearly half the town's population. Charlotte had showcased work by local artists alongside pieces by some of the lesser-known contemporary artists she'd championed in New York. The combination had created something unique, a space that honored both the community's artistic heritage and its connection to broader cultural movements. It was at the gallery's opening reception that Charlotte had first met Jake Thompson. She'd been discussing a landscape painting with Mrs. Chun, the local librarian, when she'd noticed a man standing alone in front of a photograph of the mountain range that surrounded their valley. He was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered hands that spoke of outdoor work and the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. His clothes were clean but clearly well worn, faded jeans, a flannel shirt that had seen better days, and boots that were functional rather than fashionable. He studied the photograph with the intensity of someone who genuinely appreciated art rather than someone trying to appear cultured. "That's my favorite piece in the show," Charlotte had said, approaching him with the easy friendliness she'd learned in small-town life. "Jake Thompson," he'd said, extending his hand with a smile that reached his blue eyes. "And you must be Charlotte. The whole town's been talking about the new gallery. Good things, I hope. Only good things. Though I have to admit, when folks said a fancy New York art dealer was moving to Willow Creek, I expected someone a little more." He'd paused, clearly searching for diplomatic language. "Pretentious," Charlotte had suggested with a laugh. "I was going to say intimidating. But pretentious works too." Their conversation had flowed easily from art to the mountain photography, to the challenges of small-town business, to Jake's work managing what he described as a little spread up in the hills. He'd been knowledgeable about art in a way that surprised Charlotte, not the surface-level appreciation of someone trying to impress, but genuine understanding of composition and technique. "You know a lot about photography for a rancher," she'd observed. "You know a lot about real life for a fancy art dealer," he'd replied with a grin that made her laugh despite herself. When the reception had ended and Charlotte had been cleaning up, Jake had lingered to help stack chairs and wash wine glasses, something none of the wealthy collectors in New York would ever have thought to do. "Can I buy you dinner sometime?" he'd asked as they'd locked up the gallery together. "There's only one restaurant in town, but Maggie makes a mean chicken fried steak." Charlotte had felt something flutter in her chest that she hadn't experienced in years, genuine excitement about getting to know someone without any agenda beyond enjoying their company. "I'd like that," she'd said. Their first date had been at Maggie's Diner, a place with vinyl booths and coffee that came in thick, white mugs. Jake had been wearing what she'd later learned was his version of dressing up: clean jeans, a button-down shirt, and boots that were only slightly less scuffed than his work pair. They'd talked for 3 hours, covering everything from Charlotte's journey to Willow Creek to Jake's love of the land he worked. He'd been curious about her art background, but had never pressed for details about why she'd left New York. When she'd mentioned her divorce in passing, he'd simply nodded and moved the conversation to safer territory. "What's the best part about ranch life?" she'd asked over coffee and pie that Maggie had insisted was on the house for our new neighbor. "The quiet," Jake had said without hesitation. "Not just the lack of noise, but the lack of pretense. Out here, you are who you are." There's no point in trying to be anything else because the land and the animals don't care about your resume or your bank account. The sentiment had resonated deeply with Charlotte, who'd spent years feeling like she was playing a role in someone else's life. Their relationship had developed slowly, naturally, like something growing in good soil with plenty of time and attention. Jake had shown her around his ranch, a modest operation that seemed to focus more on sustainable land management than maximum profit. His house was small but comfortable, filled with books about agriculture and conservation, artwork by local artists, and furniture that prioritized function over style. "It's not much," he'd said the first time she'd visited, "but it's mine. Inherited it from my grandfather and his grandfather before him." "It's perfect," Charlotte had replied, and she'd meant it. After years of living in spaces designed more for impressing others than for actual living, Jake's house felt like a home. They'd fallen into an easy routine of shared dinners, long walks through the valley, and conversations that lasted until the early hours of morning. Charlotte had learned that Jake was 36, had never been married, and seemed to have no interest in the kind of ambitious networking that had consumed Richard's every waking moment. "Don't you want more?" she'd asked one evening as they'd sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "More what?" "I don't know. Bigger ranch, more cattle, expansion into new markets. The kind of things that drive most businessmen." Jake had been quiet for a moment, considering her question with the thoughtfulness she'd come to appreciate about him. "I've got everything I need," he'd said finally. "Good land, good neighbors, work that matters. Why would I want to complicate that by always reaching for something bigger?" It was a philosophy so different from Richard's constant hunger for growth and dominance that Charlotte had found it almost revolutionary. 6 months into their relationship, Jake had proposed in the most unassuming way possible. They'd been hiking to their favorite spot, a meadow that overlooked the entire valley, when he'd suddenly stopped walking and had turned to face her with an expression of nervous determination. "Charlotte," he'd said, pulling a small velvet box from his jacket pocket, "I know I'm not rich, and I know I can't give you the kind of life you're probably used to. But I love you more than I've ever loved anything, and I promise that if you'll marry me, I'll spend every day trying to make you happy." The ring had been beautiful but modest, a simple solitaire that caught the mountain light and reflected it back like a promise. It was nothing like the ostentatious 3-carat diamond Richard had presented with professional photography and champagne that cost more per bottle than most people spend on groceries in a month. "Jake," Charlotte had said, tears streaming down her face as she looked at this man who was offering her something Richard never had, authentic love without conditions or calculations. "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes." They'd married 3 months later in the small church where Jake's family had worshipped for generations. Charlotte had worn a simple cream-colored dress from a boutique in the nearest big town, and Jake had worn a new suit that he'd clearly been uncomfortable in until Charlotte had assured him he looked perfect. The reception had been held in the church fellowship hall, with food prepared by various community members and music provided by a local bluegrass band. It was everything Charlotte's first wedding hadn't been: intimate, genuine, and focused on celebrating love rather than displaying wealth. "You happy?" Jake had asked as they danced to their first song as husband and wife. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Charlotte had replied, and she'd meant every word. Moving into Jake's house had required some adjustment. It was significantly smaller than any place Charlotte had lived since college, but she'd found joy in the challenge of creating beauty within constraints. She'd contributed some of her favorite art pieces and had helped Jake organize his collection of books and family photographs into something that felt like a reflection of both their personalities. Her gallery had continued to thrive, drawing visitors from larger towns and even from out of state. Charlotte had developed a reputation for discovering emerging artists and for creating exhibitions that connected rural and urban artistic communities in meaningful ways. Jake had been supportive of her work in ways Richard never had been. He'd helped with gallery renovations, had attended every opening, and had genuinely engaged with the artists and their work rather than treating cultural events as networking opportunities. "You're glowing," Mrs. Patterson had observed one morning when Charlotte had stopped by for coffee 6 months into her marriage. "I'm happy," Charlotte had replied simply. "It shows. Jake's good for you." "He is." But even in her happiness, Charlotte had begun to notice small things about her husband that didn't quite fit with his image as a simple rancher struggling to make ends meet on inherited land. Sometimes the phone calls he took privately on the porch were more business-oriented than seemed necessary for someone managing a small ranch. The wine collection in their basement was surprisingly sophisticated for someone who claimed his grandfather had preferred whiskey. The art books on his shelves included first-edition volumes that would have been expensive even for Charlotte's gallery to acquire. Most puzzling were the moments when Jake's carefully maintained image of simplicity would slip, revealing glimpses of knowledge and sophistication that seemed inconsistent with his background. "This piece reminds me of something I saw at the Whitney," he'd commented casually while helping Charlotte hang a new exhibition. "You've been to the Whitney?" she'd asked, surprised. "What? Oh yeah, years ago. Business trip to New York." But when she'd pressed for details about what kind of business would take a Montana rancher to New York City's most prestigious contemporary art museum, Jake had changed the subject with the skill of someone practiced in deflection. Similarly, when they'd attended a Cattlemen's Association meeting in Billings, Charlotte had been surprised by the deference other ranchers had shown Jake. Men who owned spreads that dwarfed his modest operation had sought his opinion on everything from land use policies to commodity pricing. "Why do they all come to you for advice?" she'd asked on the drive home. "Experience," Jake had said simply. "The Thompson family's been working this land for a long time." But Charlotte had begun to suspect there was more to the story than Jake was sharing. Not because she distrusted him. Their relationship was built on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect that felt unshakable, but because the pieces of his life didn't quite form the complete picture he'd presented. It wasn't until their first anniversary, when Charlotte had been organizing their home office to surprise Jake with a more efficient filing system, that she discovered the documents that would change everything she thought she knew about her quiet rancher husband. The manila folder had been tucked behind Jake's collection of agricultural journals, almost hidden but not quite concealed. Charlotte hadn't been snooping. She'd genuinely been trying to organize their shared space as an anniversary surprise. But when the folder had slipped out from between two magazines, the official-looking documents inside had immediately caught her attention. Property deeds, legal documents bearing the Thompson Holdings logo, and numbers that made Charlotte's breath catch in her throat. 50,000 acres in Montana, 125,000 acres in Wyoming, 200,000 acres in North Dakota, and page after page of Texas holdings that seemed to stretch across counties she'd never heard of, covering an area that her mind couldn't quite comprehend. "This can't be right," she whispered to herself, spreading the documents across Jake's desk like pieces of a puzzle that refused to form a coherent picture. But the signatures were Jake's. The legal language was clear and unambiguous. Her husband, her simple, modest rancher husband who drove a 15-year-old pickup truck and mended his own fences, apparently owned more land than some small countries. Charlotte sank into Jake's desk chair, her hands shaking as she continued reading. These weren't just empty land holdings. There were oil leases, mineral rights, commercial real estate developments, and what appeared to be a diversified investment portfolio that included technology companies, renewable energy projects, and agricultural operations spanning multiple states. The estimated value listed on the most recent appraisal document made her feel dizzy. $47.8 billion. Billion. With a B. "Charlotte, you home?" Jake's voice called from the front door, and she heard his boots on the hardwood floor as he kicked off the mud from his afternoon work. She tried to organize the papers, tried to make sense of what she was seeing, but her hands were trembling too badly to be effective. By the time Jake appeared in the doorway of their home office, documents were scattered across the desk like evidence of some crime she didn't understand. "Hey, beautiful," Jake started to say, then stopped when he saw her expression. His gaze moved from her face to the papers spread across the desk, and Charlotte watched as his expression changed from casual affection to something that looked like panic mixed with resignation. "Charlotte," he said quietly, his voice carrying the tone of someone who'd been dreading this moment for a long time. "I can explain." "Can you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I'm looking at documents that say my husband owns half of Montana and apparently most of Texas, and I'm trying to figure out why the man I married has been pretending to struggle financially for the past 2 years." Jake stepped into the room, his movements careful and deliberate, like someone approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden gesture. "I wasn't pretending to struggle," he said. "I was choosing to live simply. There's a difference. Is there?" Charlotte's voice was getting stronger now, fueled by a combination of confusion and something that felt uncomfortably like betrayal. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been lying to me about who you are for our entire relationship." "I haven't lied to you about anything that matters," Jake said firmly. "I'm the same man who proposed to you in that meadow. I'm the same man who helps you hang art in the gallery and fixes your coffee every morning exactly the way you like it. The only thing that's different is now you know how much land my family owns." "Your family?" Charlotte repeated. "Tell me about your family, Jake. Because apparently there's a lot you left out of that story." Jake sat down in the chair across from his desk, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked genuinely uncomfortable in his own home. "The Thompson family has been in the land business for 5 generations, he began slowly. "My great-great-grandfather started with a homestead claim and kept acquiring adjacent properties whenever they came available. Each generation added to the holdings, always buying more land, always thinking long-term about what would be valuable decades down the road. So you inherited all of this." "Most of it. Some I've acquired myself over the past 15 years, but the foundation was built by men who understood that land is the one thing they're not making more of." Charlotte picked up one of the Texas deeds, staring at the acreage numbers that seemed impossible. "Jake, according to this, you own 890,000 acres in Texas alone. Do you understand what that means?" "It means my great-grandfather was very good at predicting where oil would be found," Jake replied quietly. "It means you own more land than Rhode Island." Charlotte's voice cracked with the strain of trying to process information that contradicted everything she thought she knew about her life. "It means you're not just wealthy. You're one of the richest people in America, and you've been letting me think we were living paycheck to paycheck." "We've never lived paycheck to paycheck," Jake said gently. "Your gallery is successful. I manage the ranch operations. We have everything we need. That's not the point." Charlotte stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over what she'd thought was Jake's modest ranch. "The point is that I've been making decisions based on completely false information about our financial situation. The point is that when I suggested we take a vacation to celebrate our anniversary, you said we couldn't afford it. I said I'd rather spend our anniversary here, in the place where we fell in love," Jake corrected. "I never said we couldn't afford anything." Charlotte turned to face him, and Jake could see tears forming in her eyes, not tears of joy or relief, but tears of someone who'd been fundamentally deceived about the nature of her reality. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would you hide this from me?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice carried pain that Charlotte had never heard from him before. "Because of what happened to you in your first marriage," he said quietly. "Because you told me about Richard, about how his wealth corrupted everything between you, about how you never knew if people loved you or loved your lifestyle. Because I wanted you to choose me for who I am, not for what I own. So you decided to make that choice for me?" Charlotte's anger was building now, fueled by the familiar feeling of having important information withheld by someone who claimed to love her. "You decided that I couldn't be trusted with the truth about your background?" "I decided that I'd rather be loved by someone who thought I was an ordinary rancher than be used by someone who knew I was worth billions," Jake replied, his own voice rising slightly. "I decided that after watching what wealth did to your first marriage, I wanted to build something real with you before you knew about the money." Charlotte stared at him, recognizing the fear beneath his words, but also feeling the sting of being managed and manipulated, even if the intentions had been protective. "Jake, I left Richard because he was a selfish, dishonest man who treated me like an accessory to his success," she said slowly. "I didn't leave him because he was wealthy. I left him because he was a terrible husband who valued money more than our marriage. But would you have given me a chance if you'd known?" Jake asked quietly. "If I'd introduced myself as Jake Thompson, heir to $1 billion land empire, would you have trusted that my interest in you was genuine? Or would you have assumed I was just another rich man looking for a beautiful wife to complete his image?" The question hung in the air between them, and Charlotte found herself struggling to answer honestly. Would she have been suspicious if Jake had revealed his wealth from the beginning? Would she have been able to trust his motivations after Richard's betrayal? I don't know, she admitted finally. But that should have been my choice to make. Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who never feel the need to show it. Are you seeing the signs that Charlotte's missing? Comment below if you think there's more to Jake than meets the eye. Before either of them could say anything else, Charlotte's phone rang with the distinctive tone she'd assigned to her attorney from the divorce proceedings. She almost ignored it. This conversation with Jake felt too important to interrupt, but something made her answer. "Charlotte, I'm sorry to bother you," came the familiar voice of Patricia Morrison, the lawyer who'd guided her through the nightmare of divorcing Richard. "But I have some news that I thought you should hear immediately." "What kind of news?" Charlotte asked, her eyes still locked on Jake's face. "Richard's been calling my office. Apparently, he's gotten wind of your new marriage, and he's asking questions about your current financial situation. He seems to think you might be interested in reconciling." Charlotte felt her stomach drop. "That's ridiculous. I'm happily married, and I have no interest in anything Richard has to say." That's what I told him. "But Charlotte, there's something else. He mentioned that he's been having your new husband investigated. He seems to think there might be some irregularities in Jake Thompson's background that you should know about." Charlotte's gaze moved to the documents still scattered across the desk. "What kind of irregularities?" "Financial ones. Charlotte, I don't know what Richard thinks he's discovered, but he's claiming that your husband has been lying to you about his assets. He wants to meet with you to discuss what he's found." The irony was so bitter Charlotte almost laughed. Here she was, discovering that her husband was worth billions, while her ex-husband was apparently convinced that Jake was hiding financial problems. "Patricia, I appreciate the call, but I'm not interested in meeting with Richard or in anything he thinks he's discovered about my husband." "Are you sure?" "Because if there are financial irregularities, there aren't," Charlotte said firmly, looking at Jake. "At least, not the kind Richard is probably hoping for." After she hung up the phone, she found Jake watching her with an expression of concern mixed with curiosity. "Richard's been having you investigated," she said simply. Jake's expression darkened. "What did he find?" "According to my attorney, he thinks you're hiding financial problems from me. He wants to meet with me to share what he's discovered about your background." "Charlotte," Jake said carefully, "there's something else you need to know about Thompson Holdings and the extent of our operations." Charlotte felt her heart sink. "More secrets, not secrets. Context." Jake stood up and moved to a filing cabinet she'd never seen him open. From it, he withdrew a leather portfolio that looked far more expensive than anything else in their modest home. "Thompson Holdings isn't just a land management company," he said, spreading new documents across the desk. "We're one of the largest private companies in the United States. Oil, natural gas, renewable energy, commercial real estate, agricultural technology, water rights, and strategic investments in emerging markets." Charlotte looked at the financial statements Jake was showing her, and the numbers made her previous shock seem quaint by comparison. This wasn't just land ownership. This was a diversified business empire that touched virtually every sector of the American economy. "How much?" she asked quietly. "Current estimates put the total value somewhere around $50 billion, Jake said, his voice carrying the weight of someone confessing to a crime. "I'm not just wealthy, Charlotte. I'm one of the wealthiest people in the country." "50 billion, Charlotte repeated numbly. "The land in Texas alone is worth about 23 billion. Oil and mineral rights add another 12 billion. The renewable energy investments have been performing better than projected, and our agricultural technology subsidiaries are leaders in sustainable farming innovation." Charlotte sank back into the chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. "Jake, do you understand what this means?" "It means I've been lying to you about who I am," Jake said quietly. "And it means I'm terrified that now that you know, everything between us is going to change." "Change how?" "Change the way you look at me. Change the way you think about our life together. Change whether you can trust that what we have is real." Charlotte studied her husband's face, seeing vulnerability there that she'd never witnessed before. This strong, confident man who'd never seemed rattled by anything was genuinely afraid of losing her. "Jake," she said slowly, "I need you to help me understand something. We've been married for a year. We've talked about everything from our childhood fears to our dreams for the future. You've seen me at my worst and supported me through healing from the worst betrayal of my life. But you couldn't trust me with the truth about your family's business. It wasn't about trust, Jake said desperately. It was about protection. Yours and mine. Protection from what? From people who would want to use you to get to me. From social climbers who would suddenly want to be your best friend. From the kind of attention that ruins privacy and genuine relationships. Jake's voice grew more passionate as he explained. Charlotte, you have no idea what it's like to grow up never knowing if people like you for yourself or for what your family can do for them. So you decided to take that choice away from me? I decided to give us a chance to build something real before the money complicated everything. Charlotte was quiet for several minutes, processing not just the financial information, but the emotional implications of Jake's deception. Finally, she looked up at him with an expression he couldn't read. Show me, she said. Show you what? Show me the rest of it. All of it. I want to understand exactly who I married. Over the next several hours, Jake walked Charlotte through the full scope of Thompson Holdings. Using a laptop she'd never seen before, apparently he'd been conducting business from a separate office in town. He showed her the organizational charts, the property maps, the investment portfolios, and the charitable foundations that operated quietly across the southwestern United States. We employ about 15,000 people across all operations, Jake explained as he navigated through corporate financial reports that looked like something from a Fortune 500 company. The renewable energy division alone generates enough clean electricity to power about 400,000 homes. And you manage all of this from Willow Creek? Charlotte asked. I manage the strategic direction. We have excellent executives running day-to-day operations. Most of them don't even know I live on a ranch in Montana. They think I'm based in Dallas or Houston. Charlotte studied the organizational charts, beginning to understand the scope of the empire Jake had inherited and expanded. Your grandfather built all this? My grandfather built the foundation. My father expanded into oil and gas. I've been focusing on diversification and sustainability. Jake pulled up another set of documents. About 60% of our current portfolio is in renewable energy and sustainable agriculture. I believe land ownership comes with environmental responsibility. And the charitable work. The Thompson Foundation operates educational programs in rural communities across Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, and Montana. We've funded about 200 schools, provided college scholarships for over 10,000 students, and we're working on a major initiative to bring high-speed internet to underserved agricultural communities. Charlotte stared at the scope of the philanthropic work, realizing that Jake had been operating as a major force for social good while maintaining the image of a simple rancher who could barely afford to take his wife on vacation. Jake, she said quietly, this is incredible work. Why would you hide this? Why wouldn't you want to share how much good your family does? Because the moment people know about the money, it changes every interaction, Jake replied. Every conversation becomes about what you can do for them instead of who you are as a person. Every relationship becomes transactional. Charlotte understood the fear he was describing, but she also felt the sting of being excluded from such a significant part of his life and identity. What about Richard's investigation? She asked. What do you think he found? Jake was quiet for a moment, then pulled up another screen on his laptop. Thompson Holdings is a private company. Our financials aren't public, and we work very hard to maintain privacy about our operations. But if Richard hired the right investigators, they might have discovered some of our property holdings or business connections. And Richard might be planning to use that information to convince you that I'm not who you think I am. Except he'll probably assume I'm hiding assets from you rather than from the world in general. Just as Jake finished speaking, Charlotte's phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed a number she recognized but hadn't seen in over 2 years, Richard Wellington himself. Charlotte looked at Jake, who nodded grimly. Answer it, he said. Let's see what he wants. Hello, Richard, Charlotte said, her voice carefully neutral. Charlotte, darling, came the familiar voice that had once made her heart race, but now just made her tired. I hope you're well. I've been thinking about you quite a lot lately. What do you want, Richard? I want to see you. I have some information about your new husband that I think you need to hear. I'm not interested in anything you have to say about my husband. Charlotte, I understand you're angry with me, and you have every right to be. But I'm calling because I care about you, and I'm worried that you're being taken advantage of. Charlotte felt anger rising in her chest. Taken advantage of how? Your husband isn't who he claims to be. I've had him investigated, and Charlotte, the man you married, is worth billions of dollars. He's been lying to you about his financial situation for your entire relationship. The accusation was so perfectly wrong that Charlotte almost laughed. And this concerns you how? It concerns me because I love you, Richard said, his voice taking on the persuasive tone he'd perfected in business negotiations. And because I can't stand the thought of another wealthy man deceiving you about his true nature. Richard, you have some nerve. Charlotte, listen to me. I know I made mistakes in our marriage. I know I hurt you terribly, and I've regretted it every day since our divorce. But at least I was honest with you about who I was. This Jake Thompson has been playing a role, pretending to be some simple rancher while he's actually one of the wealthiest landowners in America. Charlotte looked at Jake, who was listening to the conversation with an expression of grim fascination. And what exactly do you suggest I do with this information? Charlotte asked. Come back to New York. Come back to me. We can start over, Charlotte. We can build the life we always planned. But this time I'll put our marriage first. I'll be the husband you deserved from the beginning. You think I should leave my husband because he's wealthy? I think you should leave him because he's been lying to you. Charlotte, doesn't this feel familiar? Doesn't this remind you of how manipulated and deceived you felt when you discovered my affairs? The comparison hit Charlotte like a physical blow, not because it was accurate, but because it revealed how little Richard understood about what had actually destroyed their marriage. Richard, she said slowly, you're right that this feels familiar, but not in the way you think. What do you mean? It feels familiar to have someone I used to trust calling me to manipulate me with partial information and false concern. It feels familiar to have someone assume they know what's best for my life without actually understanding what makes me happy. Charlotte, I'm hanging up now, Richard, and I don't want you to contact me again. I don't want you investigating my husband, and I don't want you pretending that you're concerned about my welfare when what you're really concerned about is your own ego. She ended the call and looked at Jake, who was watching her with an expression of admiration mixed with relief. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For not believing him. For not letting him convince you that what we have isn't real. Charlotte was quiet for a moment, considering everything that had happened in the past few hours, the discovery of Jake's wealth, the revelation about Thompson Holdings, Richard's phone call, and her own confused feelings about truth and deception in relationships. Jake, she said finally, I need you to understand something. Richard didn't destroy our marriage because he was wealthy or because he hid his wealth from me. He destroyed our marriage because he was selfish, manipulative, and dishonest about things that actually mattered. I know that, do you? Because it seems like you've been so afraid of being judged for your money that you haven't considered whether hiding it might be a form of dishonesty too. Jake's expression grew thoughtful. Are you saying you think I was wrong to keep this private? I'm saying I think we need to figure out how to be honest with each other about everything, including the things that scare us. They talked until nearly dawn, working through the complex emotions surrounding money, trust, and authenticity in relationships. Jake explained his family's philosophy about wealth, that it should be used responsibly but never flaunted, that true character was revealed in how someone treated people who couldn't do anything for them, and that the best way to avoid being loved for the wrong reasons was to make sure people fell in love with you before they knew you had anything to offer besides yourself. Charlotte shared her own journey from the shallow social world of New York's tech elite to the authentic community she'd found in Willow Creek, and how much she'd valued their relationship precisely because it had felt so different from the transactional dynamics of her previous life. I don't care that you're wealthy, she said as the sun began to rise over the mountains. I care that you didn't trust me enough to share that part of your life with me. And I care that my fear of losing you led me to create exactly the kind of situation that could lose you, Jake replied. So where does that leave us? Jake was quiet for a moment, then stood up and walked to the window that looked out over their property. It leaves us with a choice. We can let this discovery create distance between us, or we can use it as an opportunity to build something even stronger. What does that look like? It looks like complete honesty going forward. It looks like me trusting you with all the parts of my life, including the complicated ones. And it looks like us figuring out together how to use the resources we have access to in ways that align with our values. Charlotte joined him at the window, and they stood together watching the sunrise paint the valley in shades of gold and pink. The view was the same one they'd enjoyed every morning for the past year. But somehow everything felt different now. Not worse, necessarily, but more complex and requiring more intentional navigation. "There's something else," Jake said quietly. "Something I need to tell you before you decide whether you want to stay married to someone who comes with this level of complexity." Charlotte felt her stomach tighten. What now? The media attention. If word gets out about Thompson Holdings and our marriage, there will be reporters, photographers, people trying to dig into our private life. The kind of attention that destroyed your sense of privacy and normalcy in New York. How much attention? Think about it, Charlotte. A secret billionaire living as a simple rancher, married to a woman who was publicly divorced from another billionaire after a scandal? It's exactly the kind of story that tabloid journalists dream about. Charlotte hadn't considered this aspect of Jake's revelation, and the thought of returning to the fishbowl existence she'd escaped made her feel claustrophobic. "And there's the family pressure," Jake continued. "My aunts and uncles who've been waiting for me to marry someone from their social circle. Business associates who'll want to cultivate relationships with my wife. Charitable organizations that will expect us to be public faces for their causes. In other words, all the things I ran away from when I left New York. Potentially, yes." Charlotte leaned against the window frame, feeling the weight of decisions she wasn't sure she was prepared to make. "Jake, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." "Okay. Do you regret marrying me? Do you wish you'd found someone who came from your world and would be more prepared for the complications that come with your level of wealth?" Jake turned to face her fully, his expression serious and intent. "Charlotte, I have never regretted a single moment of our relationship. Marrying you was the best decision I've ever made, and not because you've made my life easier, but because you've made it real." "What does that mean?" "It means that for the first time in my adult life, I wake up every morning excited about the day ahead instead of just going through the motions of managing responsibilities. It means I've experienced what it feels like to be loved for who I am rather than what I can provide. It means I've learned the difference between being successful and being happy." Charlotte felt tears forming in her eyes as she heard the sincerity in Jake's voice. "But I also need to be honest with you about what staying married to me might cost you," Jake continued. "Your privacy, your anonymity, the simple life we've built here in Willow Creek. If we're going to make this work, we need to figure out how to protect the things that matter most to both of us." Just when Charlotte thinks she understands her husband, everything she believed gets turned upside down. Subscribe and hit that notification bell because the next revelation will blow your mind completely. Before Charlotte could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was brief but ominous. "Mrs. Thompson, this is Jessica Martinez from Entertainment Weekly. We'd love to discuss your marriage to billionaire land baron Jake Thompson. Please call at your earliest convenience." Charlotte showed the message to Jake, whose expression immediately darkened. "It's starting," he said grimly. "How did they find out?" Richard's investigation probably led to some inquiries that caught the attention of people who follow wealth and power stories. Once one journalist starts digging, word spreads quickly. Charlotte's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from a number she didn't recognize. She declined the call, but it was immediately followed by another from a different unknown number. "Jake, what do we do?" "We have options," Jake said, his voice taking on a business-like tone that Charlotte had never heard from him before. "We can try to maintain privacy and hope the story dies down. We can be proactive and control the narrative by giving one carefully managed interview. Or we can use this as an opportunity to be public about the work Thompson Holdings does and turn the attention into something positive for the causes we care about." Charlotte considered the options, none of which seemed particularly appealing. "What would you prefer?" "Honestly, I prefer to go back to yesterday morning when the biggest decision we had to make was whether to expand the gallery or take a vacation." Despite everything, Charlotte smiled. "That's not an option, is it?" "Not anymore." They spent the rest of the morning fielding phone calls from journalists, declining most interviews but gathering information about how the story was developing. By noon, Charlotte's phone was ringing constantly, and Jake's business phone, which she'd never even known he had, was buzzing with calls from corporate communications specialists, family attorneys, and what sounded like crisis management experts. "This is insane," Charlotte said after declining her 15th interview request. Yesterday, I was worried about whether we could afford to reframe the art in the gallery's back room. Today, I'm being asked to comment on my husband's status as one of the richest people in America. Charlotte, Jake said carefully, there's one more thing we need to discuss. Please tell me there isn't a third revelation today. This isn't about me. It's about you and what you want for our future. Charlotte looked at her husband, noting the seriousness in his expression. What do you mean? I mean that now that you know about Thompson Holdings, you have choices to make about how involved you want to be in that world. The wealth isn't just mine anymore, it's ours. The opportunities and responsibilities that come with it are ours too. I don't understand. Jake pulled out another document Charlotte hadn't seen before, their marriage certificate, along with some legal papers she didn't recognize. Montana is a community property state, Jake explained. Everything I own became half yours the moment we got married. You're not just married to a billionaire, Charlotte. You are a billionaire. The words hit Charlotte like a physical blow. She sat down heavily in the nearest chair, trying to process the implications of what Jake was telling her. That's not possible, she said weakly. It's not only possible, it's legally binding. According to these documents, you currently own half of Thompson Holdings. You have decision-making authority over a $50 billion empire, whether you want it or not. Charlotte stared at the papers, seeing her name listed as co-owner of assets she couldn't have imagined owning just 24 hours earlier. Jake, I can't. I don't know how to. You don't have to know anything right now, Jake said gently. But you need to understand that this isn't just about learning that your husband is wealthy. This is about deciding what kind of life you want to build with resources that could literally change the world. What does that mean? It means we could fund educational initiatives that reach millions of children instead of thousands. It means we could invest in renewable energy projects that could help address climate change. It means we could use our land holdings to pioneer sustainable agriculture practices that other ranchers and farmers could adopt. Charlotte looked at her husband with new understanding. This is why you've been so careful about privacy, isn't it? It's not just about protecting yourself from gold diggers. It's about protecting the ability to do meaningful work without being distracted by public attention. Partly yes, but it's also about something else. What? It's about making sure that the person I share this responsibility with is someone who cares about using it well. Someone who won't be corrupted by the power or overwhelmed by the pressure. Charlotte stood up and walked to the window again, looking out at the valley that had become her home and sanctuary. Jake, I need you to answer something honestly. Anything. When you married me, did you already know that I would become co-owner of all this? Jake was quiet for a moment. Yes. And you were okay with that? With giving someone you'd known for less than 2 years that much power over your family's legacy? Charlotte, I wasn't giving you power over anything. I was choosing a partner to share the responsibility. What if I'd turned out to be someone who wanted to use the wealth selfishly? What if I'd been someone who cared more about status and luxury than about doing good with the resources? Then I would have been a terrible judge of character, Jake replied simply. But I wasn't worried about that. Why not? Because I spent a year watching how you treated people. I watched you build genuine relationships with everyone in Willow Creek, from Mrs. Patterson to the teenagers who help at the gallery. I watched you use your own resources to support local artists and community events. I watched you choose substance over flash every single day. Charlotte felt something shift in her chest as she understood what Jake was really saying. You weren't just falling in love with me. You were evaluating whether I was someone you could trust with your family's legacy. I was falling in love with someone who I knew I could trust with everything that mattered to me, Jake corrected. There's a difference. Before Charlotte could respond, there was a knock at their front door, unusual in Willow Creek, where most people announced visits with phone calls first. Jake looked through the window, and his expression immediately tensed. Who is it? Charlotte asked. A man in an expensive suit standing next to a car with New York plates. Charlotte's heart sank as she realized who it probably was. Richard. Stay here, Jake said, moving toward the door with the kind of protective energy Charlotte had never seen from him before. No, Charlotte said firmly. If Richard drove all the way to Montana to confront me, I'm going to handle it myself. She opened the door to find her ex-husband standing on their porch, looking completely out of place in his designer clothing and polished shoes. He was still handsome in the way that money and personal trainers could maintain, but Charlotte was struck by how artificial he seemed compared to Jake's natural confidence. "Hello, Charlotte," Richard said, his voice carrying the smooth charm that had once impressed her but now just sounded manipulative. "You look wonderful." "What are you doing here, Richard?" "I came to talk sense into you, and to meet the man who's been deceiving my ex-wife." Jake appeared beside Charlotte, and Charlotte watched Richard's expression change as he took in her husband's appearance. She could see Richard processing Jake's worn jeans, work shirt, and the kind of understated confidence that couldn't be bought or faked. "You must be Jake Thompson," Richard said, extending his hand in a gesture that seemed more like a challenge than a greeting. "And you must be Richard Wellington," Jake replied, shaking Richard's hand with the firm grip of someone accustomed to physical work. "What brings you to Montana?" "Concern for Charlotte's welfare," Richard said smoothly. "I think she deserves to know who she really married." "And who do you think she married?" Jake asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "A liar. A manipulator. Someone who's been playing a role to deceive a vulnerable woman into a relationship she wouldn't have entered if she'd known the truth." Charlotte felt anger rising in her chest at Richard's presumption and condescension. "Richard, you need to leave. Now." "Charlotte, please. Just listen to what I have to say. This man owns billions of dollars in assets, and he's been pretending to be some simple rancher barely making ends meet. Don't you see the parallels to our marriage? Don't you see how you're being manipulated again?" "The only person who ever manipulated me was you," Charlotte said firmly. "Jake never lied to me about anything that mattered. He lied to you about everything that mattered." Richard's composure was beginning to crack, revealing the ego and entitlement beneath his polished exterior. "He lied about his wealth, his family background, his business empire. How is that different from what you accused me of doing?" "Because Jake kept his money private to protect our relationship," Charlotte replied. "You used your money to control and diminish our relationship. Because Jake chose to live simply despite his wealth. You used your wealth to make me feel small and dependent. Because Jake saw me as an equal partner worth protecting. You saw me as a trophy worth showing off." Richard's expression grew desperate. "Charlotte, I know I made mistakes, but I've learned from them. I've changed. Come back to New York with me, and I'll prove that I can be the husband you deserved." "I already have the husband I deserve," Charlotte said quietly. "You have a husband who's been lying to you for 2 years. "I have a husband who's been protecting me for 2 years, Charlotte corrected. "There's a difference, Richard. One that you'll never understand because you've never loved anyone more than you love yourself." Richard's facade finally cracked completely. "You're making a mistake, Charlotte. This simple life, this small-town fantasy, it's not real. You're too sophisticated for this place, too cultured for this kind of man. You belong in New York, with people who appreciate your intelligence and beauty." "What I belong to," Charlotte said firmly, "is someone who appreciates my intelligence and beauty enough to trust me with the truth about his life, even when it's complicated and scary." She looked at Jake, who was watching the confrontation with the calm attention of someone prepared to intervene if necessary, but respecting her ability to handle the situation herself. "Richard, I want you to leave now. I want you to stop investigating my husband, stop calling my attorney, and stop pretending that your concern for my welfare is anything other than wounded pride and ego. You'll regret this," Richard said, his tone shifting from pleading to threatening. "When the media attention becomes overwhelming, when the social pressures start mounting, when you realize what you've gotten yourself into, you'll remember that I offered you a way back to a life that made sense." "The only thing I regret," Charlotte replied, "is that it took me so long to understand the difference between being married to someone successful and being married to someone worthwhile." After Richard left, spinning gravel in their driveway in a display of petulance that summarized everything wrong with his character, Charlotte and Jake stood together on their porch, watching the dust settle. "Are you okay?" Jake asked. "I'm better than okay," Charlotte replied, surprising herself with how true that statement felt. "For the first time since I found those documents this morning, I'm clear about what I want." "What's that?" Charlotte turned to face her husband, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time, not as the simple rancher she'd fallen in love with, not as the secret billionaire she'd discovered, but as the man who'd chosen to share his life and his responsibilities with her. "I want to be your partner," she said simply. "In everything. The land management, the business decisions, the charitable work, the media attention, the family pressure, all of it. I want to figure out how to use what we have to make the world better, and I want to do it together. Jake's smile was brighter than the Montana sunrise. Are you sure? I'm sure. But I have conditions. Name them. No more secrets. No more protecting me from information. I need to make informed decisions about our life. And no more assuming that because I was hurt by wealth before, I can't handle wealth responsibly now. Done, Jake said without hesitation. And one more thing. What's that? We do this our way. We don't let the media attention or the social pressure or the family expectations change who we are together. We stay in Willow Creek. We keep the gallery. We maintain the life we've built here. And we use the resources we have access to make that life bigger and better for everyone, including ourselves. Charlotte considered the question, thinking about everything that had changed in the past 24 hours and everything that had remained constant. Especially ourselves, she said finally. Because what we have together, the trust, the partnership, the love that's built on knowing each other's real character, that's worth more than all the land in Texas. Jake kissed her then, soft and deep and full of gratitude for second chances and honest conversations and the courage to choose love over fear. Partners, he said. Partners, Charlotte agreed. 6 months later, Charlotte stood in the newly expanded Willow Creek Cultural Center, watching as a group of high school students from 3 rural counties worked with professional artists to create a mural that would celebrate the agricultural heritage of Montana. The building that had once housed only her small gallery now sprawled across an entire city block, featuring artist studios, computer labs equipped with the latest digital art software, and workshop spaces where local children could explore everything from traditional painting to cutting-edge virtual reality art creation. The enrollment numbers just came in, Jake said, approaching her with a tablet that showed registration data from their various programs. We've got waiting lists for every single class, and schools from 7 states have requested our curriculum packages. Charlotte smiled as she watched a 12-year-old girl from a nearby ranch explain her sculpture to a visiting art critic from New York. 6 months ago, that same child had never touched clay. Now she was articulating complex artistic concepts with the confidence of someone who discovered a passion worth pursuing. What about the renewable energy training programs? Charlotte asked. Fully booked through next year. We've got ranchers' kids learning to install and maintain solar panels, and our wind turbine technician certification program has a 98% job placement rate. The integration of environmental education with artistic expression had been Charlotte's idea, born from her realization that rural communities needed both economic opportunities and cultural enrichment. Using Thompson Holdings resources, they'd created a model that other regions were already requesting permission to replicate. Jake, look at this, Charlotte said, pointing to a corner where a young man was teaching elderly community members how to use tablets to document oral histories through digital storytelling. Mrs. Patterson just finished recording her grandmother's stories about homesteading. Those stories would have been lost forever if we hadn't created this program. And now they'll be preserved in the Smithsonian's digital archives, Jake replied, the pride in his voice evident, along with stories from 43 other rural communities across our network. Charlotte marveled at how naturally they'd fallen into true partnership once the secrets had been eliminated. Jake's business acumen and her creative vision had combined to create something neither could have achieved alone. More importantly, the wealth that had once seemed like a burden or a secret to protect had become a tool for transformation that felt authentic to both their values. The board meeting went well? Charlotte asked. They'd instituted monthly board meetings for Thompson Holdings where Charlotte had equal decision-making authority with Jake, a transition that had been challenging for some of the older family members but had ultimately strengthened the company's strategic direction. Better than well. The sustainable agriculture initiatives are exceeding all projections, and the art education programs are generating the kind of positive media coverage that usually costs millions in public relations consulting. And the family pressure? Jake's expression grew amused. Aunt Margaret actually apologized for questioning your qualifications. Apparently, the Harvard Business Review article about our integrated approach to rural development impressed her more than any debutante ball credentials could have. Charlotte laughed, remembering the initial family dinner where Jake's relatives had made it clear they'd expected him to marry someone from their established social circle. The transformation in their attitudes had been gradual but complete, especially after Charlotte had presented a 5-year strategic plan that would double the foundation's impact while maintaining the family's commitment to privacy and authentic values. Speaking of media coverage, Jake said, "We got another interview request, this time from Forbes, for their annual philanthropy issue. What did you tell them?" "I told them we'd consider it if they agreed to focus on the work rather than our personal story, and if they'd commit to featuring some of the program participants as prominently as they feature us." Charlotte nodded approvingly. They developed a media strategy that leveraged attention to benefit their causes while protecting their privacy and the authentic community relationships they'd built in Willow Creek. The key had been learning to control the narrative rather than avoiding it entirely. Charlotte, Jake, called Maria Santos, a 17-year-old from New Mexico whose scholarship to study environmental engineering at Stanford had been funded through their education initiative. "Come see what we've created." They followed Maria to a computer workstation where she and 3 other students were putting finishing touches on a virtual reality experience that would allow users to explore sustainable ranching practices. The sophistication of their work rivaled professional productions, and Charlotte felt the familiar surge of pride at seeing young people discover capabilities they'd never known they possessed. "This is incredible, Maria," Charlotte said, trying on the VR headset and finding herself standing in a digital recreation of a ranch that incorporated every sustainable practice their agricultural programs taught. "How long did this take you to create?" "About 3 months, working weekends and after school. But Miss Charlotte, the best part is that we're already getting requests from other schools to use this in their environmental science classes." "What would you need to make those adaptations?" Jake asked, immediately recognizing a scalable opportunity. "Just some additional funding for software licenses and maybe some help with distribution," Maria replied. "But we could create custom experiences for different agricultural regions and different educational levels." Charlotte and Jake exchanged a look that communicated entire conversations developed over months of partnership. Within minutes, they'd committed funding for Maria's team to spend the summer developing a full curriculum package that could be distributed to rural schools across the country. "This is how it works, isn't it?" Charlotte mused as they watched Maria and her team celebrate the news. "We provide resources and opportunities. They create solutions we could never have imagined." "Better solutions," Jake agreed, "because they understand the problems from the inside." As the day's programs concluded and the center emptied of students and community members, Charlotte and Jake found themselves alone in the main gallery space. The walls were covered with artwork created by local participants, everything from traditional landscapes to abstract pieces exploring themes of land use and environmental stewardship. "Do you ever miss it?" Jake asked. "The simplicity of when you thought I was just a rancher struggling to make ends meet?" Charlotte considered the question seriously. "I miss the illusion that our biggest problems were small ones," she said honestly. "But I don't miss feeling like I was living only a fraction of the life I was capable of living." "What do you mean?" "I mean that when I thought our resources were limited, I was thinking small, making a difference for a few dozen people instead of thousands. Supporting a handful of artists instead of creating systematic change in how rural communities access arts education. And the pressure? The responsibility of knowing that our decisions affect so many people. It's overwhelming sometimes," Charlotte admitted. "But it's also energizing. When I wake up knowing that our choices today might determine whether a brilliant kid in rural Texas gets the opportunity to develop her artistic talents, that feels like the most meaningful way I could possibly spend my life." Jake nodded, understanding completely. "I used to think the money was a burden I inherited. Now I think it's a tool we've learned to use skillfully. Together," Charlotte added. "I couldn't handle this scope of responsibility alone, and I wouldn't want to." As they locked up the center and walked to their car, Jake had finally agreed to replace his ancient pickup truck with a hybrid SUV that could safely transport visiting artists and program equipment. Charlotte reflected on how much had changed since that morning she'd discovered the property deeds in Jake's desk. "Jake, I need to tell you something." "What's that?" "Richard was right about one thing. Learning about your wealth did change everything between us." Jake's expression grew concerned. "How so?" "It changed everything for the better. Not because I care about the money, but because sharing the responsibility for using it well has made our partnership deeper and stronger than I ever imagined possible. Even with all the complications, the media attention, the family dynamics, the business pressures, especially with all the complications. Because now I know that when life gets difficult, we handle it together. When opportunities arise, we evaluate them together. When decisions need to be made that affect thousands of people, we make them together. No more secrets. No more secrets. No more protecting each other from information we need to navigate our shared life. 2 years later, Charlotte Wellington Thompson stood on the stage of the National Arts Education Conference, looking out at an audience of educators, policymakers, and philanthropists from across the country. The conference was being held in Denver, just 3 hours from Willow Creek, and she could see familiar faces in the audience, teachers who'd implemented their curriculum, students who'd benefited from their programs, and community members who'd become advocates for rural arts education. When people ask me about the secret to building successful community partnerships, Charlotte said, her voice carrying clearly through the conference center, I tell them it's simple. Listen more than you talk, invest in people rather than projects, and never assume you know what a community needs better than the community itself knows. The presentation chronicled the growth of the Thompson Wellington Foundation's work. They'd kept both their names for the organization, finding that the combination honored both their backgrounds while creating something new together. In 2 years, their model had been replicated in 47 rural communities across 12 states, reaching over 25,000 students annually. The most important lesson we've learned, Charlotte continued, is that authentic wealth isn't measured by what you can afford to buy. It's measured by what you can afford to give away, not just money, but time, attention, respect, and genuine partnership. After her presentation, Charlotte was approached by a young woman whose face was familiar, but whose context she couldn't immediately place. Mrs. Thompson, I'm Madison Foster. I was Richard Wellington's assistant about 3 years ago. Charlotte felt a moment of recognition mixed with surprise. This was the woman whose affair with Richard had precipitated Charlotte's divorce and, ultimately, led to her meeting Jake. Madison, Charlotte said carefully. How are you? I'm well, thank you. I wanted to apologize for my role in what happened. I was young and ambitious, and I made choices I'm not proud of. That's in the past, Charlotte replied gently. I hope you're happy now. I am actually. I went back to school, got my MBA, and I'm working for a nonprofit that provides business training to women entrepreneurs. I heard about your foundation's work, and I wanted to say that what you and your husband have built is truly inspiring. Charlotte studied the young woman's face, seeing genuine remorse and growth that reminded her how much people could change when they committed to becoming better versions of themselves. Would you be interested in visiting Willow Creek sometime? Charlotte asked impulsively. We're always looking for people with business skills who want to contribute to rural community development. Madison's face lit up with surprise and gratitude. I would love that. Thank you for giving me a chance to be part of something meaningful. As Charlotte drove home to Montana, she reflected on the strange turns life could take. The woman whose betrayal had destroyed her first marriage might now become part of the work she was building with her second husband. Richard's investigation had led to media attention that had ultimately helped their foundation reach more communities. The wealth she'd once been afraid to trust had become the foundation for the most authentic life she'd ever lived. When she pulled into their driveway, the same modest ranch house, though they'd expanded it slightly to accommodate a proper home office and guest rooms for visiting artists, Jake was waiting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and the kind of smile that still made her heart skip after 3 years of marriage. How did it go? He asked, wrapping his arms around her as she settled beside him on the porch swing they'd added last summer. Better than I expected. We got funding commitments from 6 new foundations, partnership interest from 3 state education departments, and invitations to present our model in Australia and New Zealand. And personally, how did it feel to be back in that world of conferences and presentations? Charlotte considered the question, sipping her coffee and looking out at the valley that had become the center of her universe. It felt good to represent our work and our values on that kind of stage. But it also felt good to know I was coming home to this. No regrets about the simple life we've chosen. Jake, there's nothing simple about managing a $50 billion foundation, overseeing educational programs in 12 states, and trying to pioneer new models for rural community development. But none of it feels complicated when we're doing it together. The most complex business decisions feel manageable when I know you're my partner in making them. The biggest challenges feel achievable when I know we're facing them as a team. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the sun set behind the mountains and listening to the sounds of their valley settling into evening. Cattle calling across distant fields, wind moving through pine trees, and the kind of peace that came from knowing exactly where you belonged. "Charlotte," Jake said quietly, "do you ever think about what advice you'd give to someone going through what you went through? Someone who'd been betrayed and was afraid to trust again?" Charlotte thought about the question, remembering the scared, broken woman who'd driven west with nothing but hurt and hope in roughly equal measure. "I'd tell them that healing isn't about finding someone who'll never hurt you," she said finally. "It's about finding someone worth the risk of being hurt by. Someone who'll choose honesty over comfort, partnership over control, and love over ego, even when it's difficult." And about wealth? About learning to navigate relationships when money complicates everything. I tell them that money reveals character, it doesn't create it. Someone who's controlling and selfish will use money to control. Someone who's generous and thoughtful will use money to create good in the world. The trick is learning to recognize the difference. If this story reminded you that the best things in life can't be bought and the richest people are often the quietest about it, smash that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to remember that true love sees the heart, not the bank account. What's the most important lesson you learned from Charlotte and Jake's journey? Drop it in the comments below. And remember, sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in plain sight. The truest measure of wealth isn't what you can afford to buy, it's what you can afford to give away. Charlotte discovered that when you choose authenticity over appearance and partnership over power, you don't just find love, you find the life you were always meant to live. This has been another story from Luxe Love Chronicles with Mr. Wentworth, where love always finds a way and second chances can transform everything. Until next time, remember that it's never too late to build something beautiful with someone who sees your true worth.